Well, good morning and good evening and good afternoon to all our online viewers, wherever you may be. My name is Russell Shell. I am the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programming. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a bi-weekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, where we feature timely analyses and informed opinions about Taiwan policy. We also organize regular public seminars, where we feature discussions about current policy developments related to Taiwan. We organize an annual symposium in the fall, where we invite practitioners and scholars to discuss the past, present, and future of US-Taiwan relations. We also now feature a regular podcast series called GTI Insights, where we talk to journalists, activists, experts about all things Taiwan. If you're not already subscribed to receive our updates, you may do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. I'll be remiss if I began today's program without thanking our co-founders, our board of directors, advisors, and of course, our staff and interns who make all our programs possible. So let's begin today's program. We are absolutely thrilled to host today's discussion on opportunities and challenges for US-Taiwan cooperation in the high-tech supply chain. The high-tech supply chain, and in particular the semiconductor industry, has emerged as an esoteric topic of discussion for insiders in Silicon Valley to a critical component of the new global economy that really just is featured in our daily conversations. From electric vehicles, smartphones, to sophisticated weapon systems, semiconductor chips increasingly form the backbone of many industries in the rapidly evolving high-tech economy. For Taiwan, this trend has been mostly a welcome development. Despite its small size and complex geopolitical status, the island democracy has nevertheless carved out a position as a global hub for technological innovation, particularly in the semiconductor sector. Led by cutting-edge firms like TSMC, Taiwan has become an indispensable partner for many countries around the world, including the United States. The US, under the Biden administration, is now seeking to develop a resilient, diverse, and secure supply chains. This upsurge in attention has arisen amid growing international concern over the threats posed by overdependence on the PRC-dominated supply chains. Now, Taiwan stands to play an even more significant role, but I think we also have to recognize that it also faces increased risks as well. In this virtual panel today, we'll explore the opportunities and challenges facing Taiwan and the United States as they work to try to bolster their cooperation in the high-tech supply chain. And we are extremely delighted to be able to feature the exceptional caliber of speakers on today's panel. I'll briefly introduce them in the order that they will be speaking. First, we'll have Alexa Lee, who is a Senior Manager of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, who focuses on trust and data innovation issues. Next, we have Adam Siegel, who is the Ira A. Lippman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security, as well as the Director of the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Next, we have Stephen Ezell, who is the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, where he focuses on science and technology policy, international competitiveness, trade and manufacturing and service issues. Last but not least, we have Rupert Hammond Chambers, the President of the US-Taiwan Business Council and the Managing Director at Bauer Group Asia. Now, I've asked each of the speakers to prepare brief opening comments, and then we will open for moderated discussion following the conclusion of Rupert's statements. And then we will close out at the end of today's session by taking your questions from the live audience members. Now, for our live audience members, you may ask your questions by sending it to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or by using the chat function in the on the YouTube page, or by tweeting us at Global Taiwan. I'll repeat these instructions later. So let's begin. Alexa, why don't you, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Russell. My name is Alexa Lee. I'm the Senior Manager of Global Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, ITI. So just a little background about ITI. ITI is an industry association representing over 80 global companies across the tech sector. We not only represent companies that directly involve in the semiconductor manufacturing supply chain, but also the downstream users of the technology. I want to thank GTI for organizing this timely discussion. I want to open my remarks by saying that in Washington, D.C., policy discussions about Taiwan have traditionally focused on democracy, human rights, or defense and regional security issues in Asia. So even though Taiwan, has long been a key hub in the global technology supply chains for decades, it really took the recent escalation of the US-China technology competition, and specifically an increased focus on semiconductors, to bring Taiwan's unique position into the spotlight. So before we dive into the supply chain, I want to reiterate the importance of these microchips to the audience. Semiconductors, or integrated circuits, are foundational technology that is irreplaceable to power the emerging technologies of the future, including artificial intelligence, AI, IoT, autonomous vehicles, and 5G. Additionally, these microchips are important not just for the tech sector, but all sectors. They power our medical devices, industrial equipment, and cars that we interact with daily, but also the most innovative defense systems that protect nations. Now we understand what these microchips do. I will talk about why Taiwan is essential in the technology supply chain. The global semiconductor ecosystem is complex, highly specialized, resource intensive, that often involves multiple stakeholders in the design, the manufacturing, assembling, testing, etc. TSMC alone dominates the manufacturing phase, capturing over half of the global foundry market. Today, only TSMC and Samsung have the capability to run cutting-edge 5-nanometer fabs. And now TSMC is planning to open a new fab that can even produce the most advanced chips in the world, 3 nanometers going forward. So next, I will share the strengths and weaknesses of Taiwan's role in the global technology supply chain. First, Taiwan is crucial to US national security and economic competitiveness, and in fact, to any country's national security and economic prosperity because of its semiconductor might. For example, in the United States, the recent semiconductor supply shortage across multiple industries has drawn increased attention to the need to incentivize semiconductor ecosystem in the US. Semiconductors are one of the top priorities in the Biden administration's agenda, and the momentum for supporting these investments has already accelerated, with an example that TSMC is bringing a leading edge fab to Arizona. We have heard that other countries in the world, such as the EU and India, are considering similar approaches. At this point, it is still unclear how the US semiconductor ecosystem will mature, but one thing is certain that for any countries who take technology innovation seriously, especially on AI and 5G, they need Taiwan closer to their supply chain. Second, Taiwan is also important to the US allies as a democracy representing free markets and a success story built on a market-driven approach. As countries in the world are calling for greater ICT supply chain cooperation, we could expect to see like-minded nations forming stronger economic ties with the island, such as the US-Taiwan Semiconductor Supply Chain Forum that was organized earlier this year, and the increased exchange between Taiwan and Japan on semiconductor cooperation. However, for any country who wants to become a leader in semiconductors to attract the Taiwanese expertise and other leaders, providing significant level of investment incentives and tax benefits will be necessary to compete with incentives offered by other competitors and offset the cost of building these capital-intensive fabs. After all, semiconductor leadership is not free. Third, Taiwan has long been investing heavily in R&D and training engineering talent. For example, TSMC has spent almost $3 billion in 2019 and recently unveiled a plan for investing $100 billion to meet the 5G and high-performance computing demand for the next generation. On talent acquisition, there has been strong public-private partnership between academics and industry, especially in the Hsinchu Industrial Park, where companies often tap into engineering talent pool with students. However, Taiwan also faces many challenges, especially cyber attacks from mainland China. Since the United States announced restrictions on Huawei, the Taiwanese semiconductor industry has reported increased cyber attacks from China, targeting at semiconductor designs, roadmap, chip design softwares, especially around the Hsinchu Industrial Park, where TSMC and many semiconductor companies are headquartered. Taiwan also faces talent competition from China, as the PRC is planning to grow its semiconductor industry and move towards self-resilience. To attract talent and technology know-how, China has ramped up its campaign to attract Taiwanese talent with huge pays, free trips home, a lot of really good education and housing benefits. And Taiwanese engineers may also be attracted by the opportunity that they can become early leaders in the Chinese semiconductor market. We have seen reports that Chinese semiconductor companies such as SMIC have continued to win over Taiwanese engineers. The semiconductor talent competition between China and Taiwan is unlikely to end anytime soon. And in fact, it could intensify if US-China technology decoupling deepens. Another supply chain challenge for Taiwan is the environment and natural disaster. In general, companies with diversified supply chains have stronger resilience and can better adjust to external supply shocks due to climate reasons. And semiconductor fabs require unique and very specialized resources to continue operating at capacity and meet the national security and customer demand around the world. So availability and stability, such as electricity and water, can significantly impact semiconductor productions. In the past, we have seen an explosion from a Japanese chemical factory impact 60% of the global supply, and Japanese earthquake impact 25% of the worldwide production of silicon wafers. So to conclude my opening remarks, even though Taiwan has these challenges in the global technology supply chain, with Taiwan's central role in semiconductors, great R&D and talent, and alignment with democracies over technology governance, Taiwan has a big role to play and will not be overlooked by the US, China, and other major players. So for that, thank you, and I will turn it over back to Russell.
Thank you very much, Alexa, for that great overview. And I think you really touched on a lot of points there that I hope that, throughout the course of this panel and the discussion, we'll be able to dive into further. But, just to highlight, I thought the point about droughts and the energy, just really sort of energy policy does really sort of just encapsulate really the complex sort of variables that affect, this supply chain. That, it's not just a supply chain. There's so many other moving pieces, and to give us even the larger backdrop of this discussion on sort of the U.S.-China tech war, if you will, or tech competition, however you want to describe it. I'm going to turn it over now to Adam, who will give us his take on the implications of the U.S.-China tech war and on U.S.-Taiwan cooperation with supply chain. Adam, the floor is yours.
Yep, thank you, Russell, and thank you, GTI, for the invite today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So let me start, as Russell said, with a larger picture, kind of at the 35,000 foot range. President Biden has already signaled, of course, how important supply chain security and resilience is to him with his executive order in February of 2021. It outlines a study for 4 different supply chains: information and communication technologies, batteries, rare earth elements and critical materials, and pharmaceuticals. In addition, there is a year-long study for what they're calling industrial bases in 6 areas: defense, public health, information technology, transportation, energy, and food production. But I think when we think about what the objectives are in relationship to the US-China tech war or Cold War, however you want to call it, I think there are 4, and maintaining a balance between all of those will be difficult. Difficult for a number of reasons that I'll go into. Those 4 goals, when the U.S. thinks about supply chains and the US-China tech war, I think the first one is, as Russell mentioned in his introduction, is security and resilience of supply chains, right? Both how do you ensure that the supply chains are secure, that adversaries are not placing backdoors into products before they arrive in the U.S., as well as our adversaries dominating a specific sector. But there's also a worry that Taiwan itself, we are too dependent on Taiwan, and in particular on TSMC, for all the reasons that Alexa so clearly went into. If you look at the National Security, the Commission on AI report, it explicitly calls out the U.S.'s dependence on Taiwan as one of the sole sources for these chips. The second, of course, is the U.S. wants to maintain its innovation lead, and U.S. companies are highly dependent on revenue from abroad, which they then fund back into R&D domestically. So how do you ensure that you don't disrupt how the U.S. innovation system works? Third, less explicitly stated by the Biden administration so far, but clearly a goal under the Trump administration, is how do you slow China down? And in particular, how do you slow China down in chips, where it is making a huge push, but still lags both on the manufacturing and the design and the equipment side. And then finally, there's this even more difficult idea, which is how do you maintain others' countries' dependence on your supply chains at the same time as you're trying to increase autonomy? And this is something that Xi Jinping has been very explicit about when he talks about dual circulation. He gave a speech in April that talked about tightening the dependence of the international industrial chain on China, and forming a strong countermeasure and deterrent ability for outsiders to artificially cut off supply. Right, so we can think of this as how do you maintain your own weaponized interdependence, if you want to use the phrase of Farrell and Newman, or we can think of it as a kind of a networked mercantilism. How do you ensure that other countries are still dependent on each other? Now, this is not going to be an easy task, right? A lot of these goals compete against each other, right? We've seen some tension in parts of the semiconductor industry about cutting off China and maintaining innovation, right? What level of product can you sell into the China market so you still ensure revenues while slowing China down and still abiding by Commerce Department entity lists and other things? It is difficult because it's probably just worth stating that supply chains are extremely complicated. For policymakers, we often just say, well, we'll just move a supply chain. The average large company has about 5,000 suppliers across different tiers. A company like Apple has 638 suppliers in tier 1 and close to 7,500 suppliers in tier 2. And so to say move a supply chain is not an easy thing. As Alexa kept stressing, the supply chains exist in ecosystems, right? So the reasons why they exist there is there are other companies that are upstream and downstream, and you just don't remove a company from that and think that it's going to produce in the same way. We see this, kind of playing out in the Foxconn saga in Wisconsin, that there is no ecosystem around that plant, and TSMC, where there are going to be other instances of semiconductor manufacturing in Arizona, but it's just not an easy thing to move. And the data and the talent to analyze these supply chains is not inside the U.S. government, right? Or the Taiwanese government, probably, for that matter, or even the Chinese government, probably. So to understand the supply chains is a real reach, and to figure out which policies apply without damaging those ecosystems is not an easy thing. Two other final points. The third is, and Alexa mentioned it, is, of course, we're just talking about US, China, and Taiwan in this discussion, but they are not the only players. Samsung, of course, is the other large player. The FT, I think today, has a headline about Japan spending more on chips. The EU is supposedly going to announce an initiative to try and seek investment in a 2-nanometer plant. So other countries are going to be investing a lot of money in this space and trying to affect how those supply chains shift and where they're located. And then finally, another point that Alexa made that I want to stress is that China has a say in all of this as well. And so not only, of course, all of the investment that's going in their domestic industry, this focus on their own supply chains. We know that there has been a group formed to look at what they're calling choke points. So how can they reduce their own dependence at the same time, as I mentioned, increasing dependence of other countries on them, the cyber theft, as Alexa mentioned, and the talent challenge. All ways that China, so far we know, has responded, but there are other tools, right? They could eventually retaliate against specific industries, or they perhaps could nationalize assets of TSMC or others, Taiwanese firms on the Chinese mainland if things get really heated. So the last point is that there's going to be a very strong diplomatic component to this supply chain strategy, right? It is not going to be just incentives for companies. It is going to involve lots of discussions with Taiwan, but also with South Korea and Japan and India through the Quad and other instruments to ensure that they do not think we are undermining their security and their technological independence and capabilities. And so we really have to think of this as both an economic and diplomatic initiative where the U.S. is both trying to, keep all of these 4 competitive goals together while making sure that our friends and allies are on the same page. And I'll stop there, Russell.
Excellent, Adam. I mean, I think you really hit the key issues there that are driving the change in Washington's approach to these issues with regards to supply chain security. So next, I want to turn it over to Stephen, who will help us focus our discussion now on the prospects and challenges for US-Taiwan high-tech supply chain cooperation. Stephen?
Well, thanks, Russell, and to the Global Taiwan Institute for the invitation to participate. I'm Stephen Ezell, the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF. We're a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit economic and technology policy think tank. So while most recognize that the United States represents one of Taiwan's most important trade and economic partners, the reality is that the converse is also true. Taiwan's economic health and vitality matters greatly to that of the United States as well. Simple trade statistics alone bear this out. In 2019, two-way trade between the countries reached over $100 billion. The United States is Taiwan's second largest trading partner, receiving 13% of the country's exports, 1/3 of its ICT exports. Conversely, Taiwan is America's 10th largest goods trading partner, and trade with Taiwan supports 210,000 American jobs, 130,000 in manufacturing. But as the Congressional Research Service has written, quote, US data on trade with Taiwan may understate the importance of Taiwan to the US economy because of the role of global supply chains. For instance, 86% of Taiwan's exports to the US comprise intermediate goods, such as semi-finished products, parts, and capital goods that US companies use to produce final products in their industries. This means that Taiwanese suppliers are vital to the health of US OEMs in a range of industries that Alexa previously mentioned. Everything obviously from ICTs, but also to medical devices, heavy machinery, construction equipment, chemicals, and pharmaceuticals. In fact, research has found that the United States has deeper inter-industry trade linkages with Taiwan than with virtually any other East Asian trade partner, and that the percentage of Taiwan's exports feeding into the US global supply chain are greater than those from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand combined. Put simply, US and Taiwanese industries are quite complementary and closely integrated, meaning that the health of Taiwanese suppliers matter crucially to the health of US OEMs. But as Alexa said, there's one industry that's more important than any other in the US-Taiwan trade relationship, and of course, that's semiconductors. Alexa laid out some of the facts. I'll go deeper. It may not catch the eye that Taiwan accounts for a measly 20% of global semiconductor production. What will catch the eye is that Taiwan accounts for 92% of semiconductor production at the most sophisticated sub-7 nanometer process levels. 92% of chips 7 nm or less are made on this island today. Taiwan's prowess in semiconductors is thanks largely to its pioneering the semiconductor foundry model, meaning it conducts outsourced contract manufacturing for fabless design companies like Qualcomm or NVIDIA or Apple. So these companies focus on chip design. They send the chips to companies like TSMC or UMC for foundry fabrication, right? Alexa mentioned that TSMC alone accounts for 50% of the global foundry market. Broadening that to all of Taiwan, Taiwan accounts for 78% of the global foundry market. Apple alone accounts for fully 25% of TSMC's revenues. But it goes both ways in the relationship. Taiwan consumes 45% of US exports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, showing how deeply integrated the US-Taiwan trade relationship is in this industry. To illustrate how important Taiwan has become to the US economy, a new study finds that a hypothetical disruption of Taiwanese semiconductor supply, whether due to natural disasters or geopolitical conflict, for 1 year would cost global ICT goods manufacturers $500 billion. While if this disruption were to become permanent, it could take a minimum of 3 years and $350 billion of investment to rebuild enough capacity in the rest of the world to replace the lost Taiwanese foundries. Just seeing the harm that the recent semiconductor shortage has inflicted on US automotive industries, with Ford alone saying it may lose as much as half of Q2 production due to a simple shortage of semiconductors, shows how profound a serious disruption would be. So as Alexa said, and Adam, the United States needs to care about Taiwan greatly because America's well-being depends greatly on Taiwan's well-being. Taiwan also illustrates the power of liberal democracy in Chinese societies. As this relationship has become so important, I'd like to offer several policy recommendations for how we can further deepen US-Taiwan trade and economic linkages. First, the United States desperately needs to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the CPTPP. And when it does, it should bring Taiwan and other allies like South Korea along with it. Second, the two countries should complete a free trade agreement. Doing so would be in both nations' interest. One study finds that a US-Taiwan FTA could increase US GDP by $3.5 billion, result in 27,000 new American jobs, and decrease the US-Taiwan trade deficit by 75%. This should be a focus of the Biden administration. If we can't do a full FTA, we should at least consider a small agreement along the lines of the digital trade agreement, which was recently completed between the US and Japan. That could be a framework we can move forward. Third, the US and Taiwan should work more closely together on innovation, such as by establishing an Innovation Experts Working Group as part of the Economic Prosperity Partnership, EPP dialogue. For instance, we could kind of negotiate an enhanced, more comprehensive science and technology agreement covering innovation in addition to the existing emphasis that exists on basic research. A particular area of opportunity here could be helping complement Taiwan's strengths in hardware with America's strengths in software. So Taiwan obviously is really great on the hardware, the foundry side, not as strong in terms of engineering capacity, research system around the services stuff that we're so good at, like AI, artificial intelligence, big data, cloud. There are a lot of synergies that we could learn from one another, kind of this hardware software integration complementarity. Fourth, we need to encourage both nations to invest more in R&D, research and development. In Taiwan, the public sector's contribution to R&D decreased from 52% in 1991 to 20% in 2017. Likewise, in the United States today, our federal government invests less in R&D as a share of GDP than we did in 1955. That's pre-Sputnik. If we're going to collectively rise to meet the China challenge, both nations are going to have to invest more in the technologies of the future. To that end, it is very good news that yesterday, out of the Senate Commerce Committee, passed a $120 billion package of legislation, this being the Endless Frontiers Act, as well as $52 billion in funding for the CHIPS Act. This is legislation, bipartisan, that would provide about $40 billion for enhancing US R&D and manufacturing capacity in semiconductors, as well as a $10 billion package of grants to level the playing field in terms of the global incentives countries apply to try and track semiconductor manufacturers. This type of legislation is critical. If we're going to compete in the future, it needs to be supported on a bipartisan basis across Congress and the administration. Two final points for me. Alexa appropriately mentioned this competition for talent. And so another way we could promote greater innovation, knowledge sharing, and brain circulation would be to work to promote US-Taiwan STEM education exchange, which has declined by 40% in terms of number of Taiwanese students visiting the United States since the year 2000. Finally, the United States needs to work harder on bringing Taiwan into more international organizations, including first bringing Taiwan into the OECD, not just as an observer, but as a full member. It should also work with the IMF and the World Bank to conduct kind of more statistical analysis of Taiwan. Taiwan's often overlooked in IMF and World Bank studies. And of course, the United States should insist on bringing Taiwan into the World Health Organization, Interpol, and ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. In conclusion, the US-Taiwan relationship is indispensable for both nations' economic and national security. And as such, Taiwan must play a central focus in the Biden administration's Asia strategy. Russell, thanks for the invitation to participate, and I look forward to Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for those concrete set of recommendations. And really to, again, like I said earlier, batting cleanup, we have Rupert Hammond Chambers, who will help really drill in on the role of semiconductors and the high-tech supply chain cooperation. Rupert, over to you.
Thank you, Russell, so much, and for GTI and all that you do to promote US-Taiwan relations. I'm deeply grateful on behalf of the membership of the US-Taiwan Business Council and Alexa and Adam and Stevens, for those I've spoken with before on panels. I really enjoyed your comments. Thank you so much. There'll be a wee bit of overlap, as Stephen noted too, in some of what I touch on, but I hopefully there'll be value added in each moment in which I touch on things that have been dealt with before. But I'd like to pull on a couple of strings just to perhaps add some insights that I feel perhaps don't get quite enough attention from the broader narrative surrounding the emerging importance of Taiwan. I want to say that I'm not, obviously there's been a history of the importance of Taiwan in the US-Taiwan relationship and Taiwan's role in the world, but I think it's shifted since 2016, 2017 in a profoundly positive, shifted and broadened in a profoundly positive way. And the economic relationship and the semiconductor space truly underscore that importance, not in of themselves, but as one piece of a broader set of pillars that are underscoring why it's so essential that Taiwan remain free, that Taiwan remain democratic, that Taiwan remain an essential friend and ally for the United States and its partners around the world. Let's touch on that a wee bit. In 2016, 2017, the Taiwan business community, the 2017, the Taiwan business community were caught off guard by the shift in US-China relations. They weren't prepared. They didn't grasp what was coming. They don't, for the most part, still have very good insights into the machinations of US-Taiwan policy. But I think even more importantly, how that policy can reach across the Pacific and shake the foundations of their business models in ways that force them to make significant adjustments. But things have accelerated since that standpoint, and we've seen several trends that I think are worth touching on. The first trend is a domestic trend in Taiwan that's having an impact on the supply chain, and that's reshoring. Accelerated inbound investment, primarily from Taiwan companies, back into Taiwan is a virtuous opportunity for the island nation, but it's also creating significant challenges on the island. And this is an instance in which my friends and colleagues on the panel have touched on somewhat. Land, power, water, human capital are all being put under significant strains by what, on the face of it, is an important and positive development for the island and its citizens. And I'll come back and touch on that a wee bit. Secondly, an issue I'd like to touch on, and really TSMC is the only one so far that has tackled it meaningfully and appropriately, is that Taiwan's largest companies that offer leadership across the board, not just directly in the technology space, but those that fund technology companies. Taiwan has a significant banking community, and there is clustering in the supply chain in many different areas. But for the most part, TSMC is the only one that has made a significant effort to attempt to represent its interests in this essential semiconductor sector in a way that can impact global policy. And what we found here is TSMC has gone and appointed board members to internationalize its board. And critically also, it is stood up a first-rate government relations department headed by a senior former Intel executive, Peter Cleveland. And Peter and his burgeoning team have been working closely with their leadership to represent the interests of the company in ways that are profoundly positive for the company, its shareholders, of course, but also meaningfully impacting the narrative on the global semiconductor sector. And that is giving Taiwan not just a government voice in this sector, but also a critical company in the supply chain a voice. And that's having an impact. And I believe that we will see more of it in time. Certainly it's starting to emerge. We've got MediaTek taking tentative steps down that road and also similarly setting up shop here. And my hope is that we are going to see more of that, because I believe it will be positive. And I believe that Taiwan companies have a great deal to offer in US considerations of public policy priorities. Taiwan domestic politics and cross-strait politics are getting a great deal of attention. I not regret to report, but my own viewing is it's all becoming a bit breathless at the moment, and I think that was most best captured by the Economist's rather breathless front page, not suggesting but outright declaring that Taiwan was the most dangerous place in the world. And I think there are many places in the world that would disagree with that, including the people on Taiwan, who've certainly lived under the threat of Chinese attack, but live in a democracy have freedom of travel, and are living productive and healthy lives, and raising families, and so on. So I don't want to appear cavalier. Certainly the threat from China is real. The Chinese are spending a great deal of money on forced modernization, and their wolf warrior diplomats are charging around the world, shouting at everybody. We can't disregard the threat that China poses. But that said, I would argue that a great deal of this is psychological operations at the moment, designed to pressure the Taiwan people, and that we've had escalation because they've been at it a long time, and over time people become numb. Pardon me. And we've also got a new administration here in the United States, and not surprisingly, from Anchorage onwards, the Chinese are looking to see what Mr. Biden and his colleagues' mettle looks like. Are they up to the China challenge? Are they going to revert to Mr. Obama's tenure, which I will frankly point out was the low point in US-China relations over the last 20 years, a really grim time for US national interest. But so far, the news has been good. Mr. Biden and his colleagues, Mr. Blinken and others are, in my opinion, so far, they're doing a really good job of consolidating what they inherited. And when we look at it through the parochial prism of Taiwan, we're really looking at consolidation and an opportunity to further grow the relationship. This is all good for the global technology supply chain and the essential relationship between the United States and Taiwan. For stability and growth in the US-Taiwan relationship, and a proper, assertive policy towards the Chinese that represents American national interest is, to me, the foundation for further growth and stability. And we need stability. I actually think that many analysts don't fully walk through the implications of Chinese control over Taiwan. It's not, to me, that China would then all of a sudden have control over production. They'd certainly occupy the island in this awful scenario. But their inability to maintain the equipment within the fabs, and that the US would almost certainly forbid its semiconductor companies from maintaining that equipment. Perhaps the Chinese might be able to run them for a wee while, but very quickly the equipment would degrade and production would come to a halt. I actually think that the software that run those machines would be wiped before we even got that far. So what I'm driving towards is we're not really dealing, in my opinion, as an analyst, with Chinese control over Taiwan semiconductor production. What we're actually looking at, which has already been touched on in our panel, what we're actually looking at is taking Taiwan's production offline in a very short period of time, with dramatic consequences for global production. Anybody that thinks I don't believe that the economic implications of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait and Chinese control over Taiwan would be localized in any way. It would have global ramifications for manufacturing, which would by implication have implications for capital markets and so on. Through the ripple effect through the economy would be profound. And of course, the political national security implications. Taiwan-China conflict is not a localized conflict. The world would be caught up in it. Just a couple more thoughts. I touched on I said prostrate, but also Taiwan domestic politics. I do encourage our viewers to keep a very close eye on the referendums that are coming in the latter part of August, if they're not delayed in any way by the recent COVID outbreak in Taiwan. Those referendums do deal with power. I think that's with the reef issue in the third LNG terminal, and they also deal with US-Taiwan relations through the prism of the pork referendum and access to US meats into the market, which obviously isn't a supply chain issue for our purposes, but it has ramifications for US-Taiwan relations, which would, in my view, cover the totality of the relationship. So keep an eye on the referendum, because it will have an impact not just parochially on an issue that we've touched on, but also the politics of the island and the relationship between the United States and Taiwan. Finally, one other area I want to touch on, we're starting to see a wee bit more of this in coverage, but I think it's worth hammering this nail a little bit. Through the work of TSMC in the previous administration and into this administration, obviously it's well understood that TSMC is standing a fab standing up a fab in the Phoenix area. And as noted by the panel, there's already a good degree of clustering in that area thanks to Intel. And we also have Samsung and Apple, of course, in the Austin area. And Intel's effort, I think, over time is going to be driven much more by industrial policy than innovation within the company. We'll see. But I think we can expect Intel to move closer to the US government in its efforts to at very least not lose any ground to TSMC and Samsung. We can expect TSMC to maximize the footprint it's established in Phoenix. And over time, the 6 fabs that have been noted in some press coverage of late, I absolutely expect to see see it established. And over time, let's say 15 years, I'm sort of pulling that out of the air a wee bit, but over time, over the next 15 years, the establishment of those 6 fabs, and what we're going to see, in my view, is a leveling out of chip production in Taiwan and the United States by TSMC, that in the long term, that's going to be the goal. What is less clear to me, and I think I know I have concerns, and I know others I talk with have concerns, is whether or not the R&D aspect of all of this will also level out, where you have what TSMC are doing. I think Stephen said 92%. Stephen, can you give me the thumbs up? Was that it? Yeah, 92% of the highest end is coming from TSMC. That's such a great point Stephen's making, because that really shows where the innovation is. That really shows where TSMC is starting to pull away. Can the United States represent an equal base for TSMC and others in that R&D area? I have some worries. One would be the politicization of our curriculums in universities right now in the US, and the direction that they're going and the priorities they're placing on STEM over other areas. I understand that's a highly politicized areas, but that's why I'm saying it. I think science and technology are standards in science and technology are being degraded in the interests of other political priorities. That, in my opinion, will have an impact on our long-term ability to offer a base for high-end R&D that can both complement what our allies are doing, as well as compete and ensure that we stay significantly ahead of our competitors, such as China. Thanks, Russell. I'll stop here.
Rupert, superb. Really just opened the aperture of our discussion here. And especially for really casting a long sort of a long gaze in what could unfold in the years and decade to come. And I speak especially thinking, about the worst case scenario in which the PRC controlled, Taiwan's position in the supply chain and the implications of that. I want to remind our audience members that we do want to hear from you, and so if you want to pose a question, you may do so by sending an email to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or by using the chat function on our YouTube page, or by tweeting us at Global Taiwan. Please include your name as well as your affiliation with your question. But I do want to exercise the moderator's prerogative here and pose a few questions for our excellent panel here. The first question, I'm going to pose this to Stephen, but I invite the other panelists to also join in, because this is a thread that I found kind of ran through all of your presentations. And that is, and I'm going to reference here, the president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, spoke at the Copenhagen Democracy Summit last week. And in her comments, she suggested that democracies should basically cooperate on the high-tech supply chain. And this in the context of pushing back against techno-authoritarianism and the effects of that on global democracies. What are your thoughts on the ideas that democracies could and should cooperate more closely in securing our high-tech supply chains? What are what are the efficacy of this, and to what extent are there mechanisms by which we could see this happen? Stephen, I'm going to sort of open it up with you, but I invite the other panelists to chime in as well with your comments on this.
I'll just say that last September, ITIF released a report called An Allied Approach to Semiconductor Competitiveness that outlined 4 broad areas in which like-minded nations could collaborate to collectively advance the competitiveness of their semiconductor ecosystem by collaborating on things such as coordinated technology development, coordinated ecosystem support, things like standards development, things like talent development, coordinated technology protection, working together to coordinate export controls of the most sophisticated semiconductor technologies like lithography, sharing information about intellectual property. How can we expand the 5i program so we can better protect trade secrets and kind of push back against the cyber espionage, the cyber theft of IP that Alexa previously mentioned. And there's a whole set of things we can do to advance supportive trade policy, whether this is things like expanding an information technology agreement, which is a trade agreement that reduces tariffs on trade in ICT goods, in which a global community is now coming together to expand and create a new ITA3 to expand the coverage. We wrote a report in January that looked at the deleterious impact of China's aggressive national semiconductor strategy, what's called the National IC Plan. One thing that report revealed was that pretty much 40% of the financing of China's major semiconductor companies like SMIC comes directly from financing from the Chinese government. This is a very aggressive industrial subsidization. We need to work together at the World Trade Organization to kind of reform subsidies disciplines, define what a public body is, put much more stringent controls on countries' use of those types of very aggressive industrial subsidies. So, across all those areas, there's an awful lot that like-minded countries can do. And I think the Quad is another opportunity, of course, this being a new relationship between the US, India, Japan, and Australia to coordinate on deepening Indo-Pacific trade relationships and exchanging intelligence. I would like to see Taiwan be brought into that community because I think it can play an important set of roles here.
Any thoughts from the other panelists? If not, we can move on. Oh, Adam? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of expectation and hope for kind of democracy alliances. I think they are good ideas. But I think we should prepare ourselves for some tension among them. I think some areas are going to be easier than others. As we mentioned before, the Europeans have their own goals in this space. I think they've made it fairly clear to the Biden administration that they're not, at this point, ready to make a choice between the US and China tech stacks. That they really, want to maintain their own technological autonomy in this space, and so they're going to have their own initiatives and efforts there. We're going to have a lot of differences in other areas that a democracy alliance might cover, for example, content moderation and disinformation. And we've been talking about, well, if we could just get the US and the EU on the same page about privacy and some of these other issues, then we can really move forward. We've been talking about that for 20, 25 years. We now have the Schrems II decision that again makes it difficult for US firms to transfer data back to the United States. So I like the more narrow focused discussions of it than I do the broader idea that somehow the democracies are all going to revolve around a set of digital technologies and fight digital authoritarianism.
I can quickly add on to what Stefan and Adam just mentioned. So on the potentially more, cooperation among like-minded democracies on supply chain issues, I think that we're definitely happy to see that the Quad have some initial meeting, but the real question is, how do you actually drill down and go deeper in those discussions? And one area I noticed that the US government has recently started focus a lot, at least within the DHS Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force. We're starting to develop this concept of what does it mean for a trusted vendor and trusted supplier. the definition of a trusted vendor, it cannot be just as simple as just as long as you don't have any foreign adversary, you're fine. It has to be, more nuanced than that. For example, it has to have really good best practices, best cybersecurity, just general cyber hygiene. It has to be a detailed list of, what can meet that standard. So when countries are, organizing supply chain cooperation discussion, it will just be good to just sit down and then go into detail. What does this mean to countries? But because, as Adam mentioned, EU may have a different concept about, what does it mean for trusted vendor as they're developing their own kind of this tech sovereignty concept. And India may also have a very different, idea about what is trusted vendor mean. Maybe it's India first, who knows? So it really comes down to just trying to gap the minor differences about what countries think, what does the trusted vendor mean? So I think that would be a really critical definition for democracies to work on.
Excellent points. I mean, and I'm going to pull on that thread a bit and pick up where Stephen had mentioned as one area of cooperation, which is on standards. And Alexa, you touched on this with definitions on trusted vendor. I want to put this question to Rupert. And this question is, there is a report that was just recently published by the Heritage Foundation by someone called Maya Clark. And in it, she raised an interesting idea, and this was in context of the defense supply chain, about the ideas on supply chain visibility, which she defined as the ability of the customer and the prime contractor to clearly see into the lowest tiers of the supply chain. Is this concept applicable to the high-tech supply chain, and this is where allies could work towards a common standard in which allies and like-minded nations could work together in the high-tech supply chain sector? Rupert?
Well, definitely, Russell. It is a long-standing challenge looking deep into tier 4, tier 5, tier 6 suppliers. In an age where supplying is outsourced, it can be very hard, even if you outsource a particular need to another company, that they aren't outsourcing it to somebody else, and you quickly lose track. So for sure, simplistically speaking, this could be an area that like-minded countries work closely on. It's highly complex and highly challenging, which I think is perhaps one of the reasons why we haven't got very far. And I think, to Alexa's superb point previously, it's great to have high-level meetings. Alexa, please forgive me, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but this is what I think you were saying. It's great to have these high-level dialogues. It's great to have meetings and mechanisms, but we really need to get deeper into these issues to have a profound and substantive impact on the subject matter. I think I'm getting that right. Yeah, that's right. Good. So it's a spot on a challenge, Russell, for sure. The writer, the author in that Heritage piece, I think understands well. Coming back to supply chain, move here to the States and cutting edge, I think it's also worth noting that in US-China competition in hard power, the Chinese need access to cutting edge chips and the dynamic chip design space to produce for their hard power platform and systems. And they're going to have an increasingly difficult time getting access to those, which by extension is going to have an increasingly profound impact on their ability to continue to produce their own cutting edge platforms and systems, whatever those might look like. And it is a pressure point, a choke point, if you will, that's very much worth looking into at the very time in which we are doing even though it's in its nascent stages, an increasingly good job of attracting the TSMCs and the Samsungs to stand up production here in the States. So should there be any disruption in supply outside of the States, at least our hard power companies are able to get access to the chips they need.
Fantastic, Rupert. I'm going to pick up. Stephen,
if I could just add briefly on that point.
Yeah.
of course, Taiwan has its action plan for welcoming overseas Taiwanese businesses to return to invest in Taiwan. UK has got Project Defend. Japan's got a $2.3 billion reshoring fund. Like-minded countries need to work together on these types of reshoring strategies to attract relocation of manufacturing activity where it's possible out of China. It won't always be the case, as Adam said, very complex supply chains, but I think a lot could be gained instead of each of these countries going off and making these own strategies if we collaborated on them. One other thing we should do, again, like with our Indo-Pacific policy, Taiwan's new southbound policy, is that we need to coordinate among like-minded countries to help our firms go into third-party marketplaces to compete with Chinese ones. So if a country like Malaysia or Indonesia is looking for a smart grid or an intelligent transportation system implementation, they're able to go to a Chinese supplier, and whether it's Huawei or CSSR, supported by hundreds of billions of dollars of export credit, and you get the whole vertical stack. When Western companies trying to compete, it's like, well, Ericsson's going to do the 5G, and when another company is going to do this part of it, is that we don't have this kind of integrated business offer. If we could work together to align export credit financing, to align kind of foreign direct development assistance, and help our companies kind of put packages together, we'd make ourselves in a much stronger position to compete against fully vertically integrated Chinese enterprises supported by the full backing of their state in these types of third-party marketplaces.
Related to that point of pushing back, Stephen, and I think it was you, maybe someone else, that had referenced the Endless Frontier Act that Congress is, sort of appears to be moving forward with. And according to Political, this legislation is meant to boost semiconductor manufacturing, but a lot of it is about pushing back against China's IP theft, about confronting Beijing and enhancing national security of the United States. To what extent does the legislation, to the extent that could or would or should, for that matter, be able to promote multilateral engagement with allies, and in particular in this high-tech supply chain that these act appears to cover? So, thoughts on really to what extent the legislation, would or should, address the issues that we are talking about today. This question, I don't know, Adam, do you want to take this?
Yeah, so I have not read the most recent version of it. I think the Times coverage of it last night seems to suggest that lots of people are sticking lots of different things in there. So my understanding is that the bill itself does not have any international collaboration parts in it. But again, I haven't read the most recent version. A lot of it is focused on these R&D hubs inside the U.S. In particular, kind of getting the concentration of innovation off the coasts into the interior. So using these R&D hubs to kind of do manufacturing extension to local economies. Now, there are still lots of ideas out there in other bills. I know Warner for a while had a bill that was looking at international tech collaboration and funding it through the State Department. So building on some of the ideas that Stephen had brought up in his presentation about doing joint R&D, not only in semiconductors, but people have been talking about AI and 5G and synthetic biology. I think many of the ideas about these tech alliances that are floating around there include an R&D or collaboration component to it. At the end of the Trump administration, they were expanding some DoD programs to some of the Five Eyes who were cut out, and then broader than that. So I do think there are lots of ideas out there floating around about, but I don't think the money would be in this Endless Frontier Act. But Stephen can correct me if I'm wrong.
I can quickly add on again, the development was just happened last night, so I hadn't had a chance to kind of really review what's inside there exactly. But overall, I would say that from industry's perspective, we definitely welcome the the Congress to provide a robust funding for the CHIPS Act. And I think I hear Stefan said that it's $52 billion. So if that's the news, that's definitely positive. But the key question is that going forward, how does these, $52 billion going to be distributed? So that's going to be the key. For example, ITI, we think that it's important to, secure the whole ecosystem of the semiconductor, but especially focusing on the manufacturing piece will be critical, because without manufacturing in there, the whole ecosystem would not come. So that's the first point. And second point, it's really important that we want to make sure all these fundings are available to all multinational chip manufacturers, because you want to attract, the best technologies, the edge to the United States. So that will be really critical to emphasize. And the last piece is that, in the future, when we're implementing out this CHIPS Act, it will be really important that the program doesn't pick winners and losers, say who is getting a quota, who is getting a set aside. We think that those approaches are, market distorting and would not, be helpful to really help the long-term balance of the supply chain. So that's just kind of some perspective from the industry side.
Fantastic. Rupert,
I
you
just
want to
had-
say something? Wait, Stephen, go ahead. You want to jump in?
Just very briefly, there are a few elements of the CHIPS Act legislation that do call for international engagement. In particular, there's a call for a $750 million multilateral security fund to support development and adoption of secure microelectronics supply chains. I want to give an example, by the way, there is that TSMC and Purdue have worked together to establish a center for secured microelectronics systems. So there will be funding and chips for more of those types of arrangements, I think. In terms of the broader Endless Frontier Act, the one place where it does talk about international R&D is that it does forbid any relationships with Chinese researchers as part of the legislation. That might be of interest. But just more broadly, I think one thing the US should think about more, if we're going to be putting another $100 billion to research, we should say that a certain percentage of that is going to fund international research collaborations with researchers from the United States and like-minded countries, whether they're European ones or Taiwan or others. And we should reciprocally insist that other countries take a certain percentage of their R&D funding and ensure that it enrolls American collaborators. That's important because research finds that research is better and more sophisticated when there are greater levels of international collaboration. I think this would be good for the science and would be good for the diplomatic relationships.
Excellent. I mean, we could stay on this question for a very long time and really just sort of unpack it all. But already some really excellent ideas, and I really do appreciate the conversation that this is eliciting among the panelists. I see that we're getting some questions from the audience, and we will definitely get to them as we approach the 15-minute mark. So I have a few more questions that I'm going to pose to the panel here. And so this has to sort of do more with, sort of, again, the mechanism of cooperation amongst US and Taiwan. And, it was referenced earlier about the economic prosperity dialogue. There was a talk about, the need to resume, negotiations between the United States and Taiwan on a FTA or a bilateral investment agreement, noting that the TIFA talks have been stalled since 2016. And I guess the question in the context of this, these critical issues that we are talking about now, what is the sort of the venue by which we can sort of, that should be the sort of the appropriate venue and mechanism to have these issues discussed so that, actions can be taken to address these issues? Is it the economic prosperity dialogue, or would TIFA, for instance, if it were to be resumed, be the appropriate venue by which these discussions should or could and should take place? What are your thoughts on what are the panel thoughts on sort of the mechanism here? Rupert, do you want to chime in on this one?
I'd certainly love to start. I'm sure my colleagues on the panel have much to say themselves. Just to touch on the creation of the EPPD, the Economic Prosperity Planning Dialogue, it was designed specifically with this kind of engagement in mind, and to me is the perfect platform. State is certainly forward-leaning, as it was under Mr. Pompeo. It is still under Mr. Blinken toward US-Taiwan relations, and the prospects for expanding that. And EPPD, in my view, is a perfect dialogue. I might also add, it is a potential dialogue that could be pushed together, as has been touched on by all the panelists, in respect to the importance of finding partners who are willing to work together. And I would cite the recent meeting between Prime Minister Suga and President Biden, in which they touched on chip cooperation. That may have a bilateral component, certainly it did initially, but to me, it makes perfect sense that whatever develops out of that narrative could potentially be in part pushed together with the EPPD to produce a North Asian a triumvirate, if you will, between the US, Taiwan, and Japan. So I think that has positives. TIFA, I do not know, for the simple reason that we have so many challenges in dealing with USTR on Taiwan policy that frankly has seemingly nothing to do with whether a Republican or a Democrat is running the country. These are deep-rooted bureaucratic issues that challenge our ability to see trade policy generally as a platform for engagement. It has been a lagging indicator, frankly, since the IPR trade secrets issue was put to bed in 2007. We've gone through successive Republican and Democratic administrations, and we run into the same problems with USTR. I would be loath to offload to them any, well, they'll have a say, of course, but any driver's seat role in this critical area, for fear that it would founder on the rocks immediately.
Any other thoughts from the other panelists?
My only thought would be that U.S. economic and national security policy needs to be fully integrated with regard to Taiwan, and the United States needs to immediately drop its policy of strategic ambiguity towards China and make it absolutely clear the status of this economy in U.S. eyes. Because I think when we are unclear about what our red lines are, that's actually quite destabilizing international relations. And in terms of Rupert's earlier point about stability, it would be a far more stable global situation if we were clear about our view of protecting the island.
Okay, thanks for that, Stephen. I know we talked a lot about convergences here, of interest between the United States and Taiwan with regards to the high-tech supply chain. But something that Adam brought up earlier was, is this narrative of concern about over-dependence, on Taiwan because of Taiwan's dominance in sectors of the supply chain. So perhaps, if putting on, maybe an opposing counsel's, hat. I mean, what are the points of divergences between the U.S. and Taiwan in terms of this high-tech supply chain? And are there ways to mitigate, those concerns? Adam, maybe I'll let you sort of take this one and see if what the others have any comments that they'd like to make.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concerns are, one, as you mentioned, kind of just overdependence and a reliance on one or primarily one supplier. And second, I think there is a concern about U.S. competitiveness in this space. And even though we don't have national champions, the U.S. will want a player to be in this space. So as Intel seems to lose its traction here, the U.S. is going to be concerned about that as well. So I don't remember if it was Stephen or Rupert who mentioned a kind of a drawing closer together of the U.S. government and Intel. That seems to me to be a likely outcome. Now, I think certainly TSMC shifting some of the fab manufacturing to the U.S. Assuages some of those concerns. It both probably makes TSMC a more likely supplier to, a trusted supply chain to the DoD and to others. It helps support the ecosystem that's clearly emerging in Phoenix and around that space. But I don't think, long term, that the U.S. will want to simply rely on TSMC. That it will want to ensure that it continues to be a player in this space. And it may be, from an R&D perspective, that we're looking at the next generation of technologies around semiconductor, that where we have we're reaching the end of, appears to be reaching the end of Moore's law. It's not clear how much more you can do on silicon. And so I know there are, certainly people out there thinking about it, encouraging, greater investment in what comes next, not in trying to catch TSMC around, 3 nanometers or some other kind of the technology we're using now.
Great, thank you, Adam. And I'm going to turn it over now to our audience questions. And we have several really good questions here. So the first one is from Chris Catrone from Tri-Orient Investments and AmCham in Taiwan. And his question, not addressed to any particular panelist, so feel free to jump on the question if you like. How can Taiwan's capital and stock markets assist US-Taiwan cooperation in the high-tech supply chain? Any takers here? Rupert, I see you moving.
Sure. Hi, Chris. It's nice to note that you're listening in on our panel. I think thematically, what would certainly fit with this morning's discussion is where capital comes together with other capital, and all capital isn't created equal, right? It just depends how smart the people are behind it. Can come together and cooperate on co-R&D, and I think that thematically certainly fits with several nails that we've been hitting this morning. And Taiwan's capital markets obviously are smaller, but they're certainly well-established investors on the island who have an extremely good eye, pardon me, for certain areas of development, more leaning towards the hardware side, of course, given the nature of Taiwan's economy, and to the extent that we can cooperate with those in co-developing R&D. I think it was Steve's point about identifying some of the money that the US government is allocating for to work with other capital from other countries, 1 for 1 or 1 for 0.5 or whatever the metric is, the multiplier. I think that there's a lot of potential there. And then also in how we go into other markets together, the southbound policy or the go south policy, depending on how old you are. You also can see capital working with capital, whether it's government plus private or whatever the mix. I think there is a lot of potential here. It will, I think, require some government direction. And on the Taiwan end, I think that Tsai government would have to come to some consensus within itself that it wanted to see more of that and then transmit it to the US.
Okay, any other takers? If not, I'll move on to the next question. Okay, so the next question is from David Gossick from Five Hills Global Strategies. He has 2 questions. I'm going to ask the first one and then move on to the second one afterwards. The first question I'm going to ask is, what impact do the resource limitations in Taiwan, as discussed by the panelists, have on expansion of semiconductor foundries in Taiwan? How can the US make our electronics ecosystem more conducive to support new semiconductor foundries from Taiwan in the US? Pretty specific question. Anyone want to take that one? Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Rupert, maybe you want to.
Sure. I mean, I don't wish to always be to be talking. And in any event, the issues in Taiwan surrounding land, power, water, and human capital are, in my opinion, the primary boundaries to the full development of Taiwan's economic potential. And although the heightened threat from China and the sort of breathless, to use that word again, coverage by much of the media of late, or I think it's calmed down a wee bit the last 2 or 3 weeks, has certainly created a sort of panicky feeling amongst some businesses, which is of note, and certainly I think is a design of the Chinese effort. As a practical matter, the physical limitations on resources in Taiwan are a significant challenge. And just in the last week, we've had 2 rolling blackouts in Taiwan, And the Taiwan government came forward today and yesterday. Was when I was up this morning, looking at some of the news stories generated today in Taiwan. You see the government pointing at Taipower and demanding, a short-term plan on how to address the rolling blackouts. But frankly, it's a wee bit disingenuous to make those sort of public statements, because the political manipulation of Taipower and the power sector generally through successive Kuomintang and DPP administrations has really created a real challenge for the island. And it's one that's not going to go away anytime soon. And of course, we've got a referendum in late August on the 4th nuclear power plant. It's incredible that issue is still in play, but here we are. So it's a good question, certainly from the attendee. But to me, yes, these physical limitations are the long-term boundaries, and I think at some level that's driving consideration of companies like TSMC. Not the only consideration, but certainly one.
So I can quickly chime in here. I think, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, electricity and water, these are really important to maintain semiconductor capacity. And I think that one area potentially Taiwan can look into more is how do you strengthen your critical infrastructure? And in the US, we have this concept, there are several critical functions, and you have to kind of level up your best practices, just maybe stronger cyber protection or stronger resources and money be spent on those areas. I'm not sure, because in the case of Taiwan, it seems like the electricity production is all being dominated by the Taipower, but definitely potentially there are ways where private sectors can get involved and maybe help with the resources and how just strengthen up the capacity in that way. But again, I think, as Rupert mentioned before, that would really depends on how much the Taipower is willing to be flexible and work with stakeholders and be creative. So potentially that is a way that the Taiwanese government could look into more.
Russell, could I try and tackle the previous question for a second?
Yeah, please.
ITIP will have a report coming out in a couple of weeks that examines what will now be China's first 20 years as a member of the World Trade Organization. And essentially what it will show is that this is not a member in good standing. We're all familiar with the types of innovation mercantilist practices the country has used, everything from IP theft to forced technology transfer, joint ventures. The litany is long. But one thing the report notes is that China now has a $610 billion fund whose specific intent is to go out onto international markets to acquire other companies. This is not capitalism. This is government-funded, state-subsidized money, often channeled through a veneer of private equity partnerships to make it look market-oriented, but it's really not. And the point I'm making is that across a number of these innovation mercantilist practices, what China tries to do is distress foreign companies. We've certainly seen this in Taiwan, where MediaTek, for instance, has been a target of some of China's predations. So the point I'm trying to make for capital markets is that a longer-term orientation and recognition of some of these practices that other countries use to try and destabilize companies, it needs to be part of the thinking. This is why countries, for instance, have really now increased foreign direct investment screening policies. But capital markets, I think, also need to be attuned to this. And for Taiwan, recognition that the long-term security and viability of the society depends on those companies succeeding. So I wouldn't be concerned about just weekly, quarterly returns, but thinking about how the structure of Taiwanese capital markets supports and enables the long-term competitiveness of the Taiwanese economy.
Great, really interesting. Thanks for those comments. The next question is from Motonobu Fujita with Rand Corp. And his question is, what role are Japan and Korea expected to play in stabilizing the global high-tech supply chain with Taiwan? How are the strengths and weaknesses of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan different? Perhaps, Adam, do you want to take this one?
So, I think we're seeing a lot of early discussions, right? I think Alexa mentioned the dialogue between Taiwan and Japan about how they can cooperate. Japan, of course, dominates at the upstream on some of the materials for the supply chain and, of semiconductors. South Korea, with Samsung, is TMC's real competitor right now on investment and technology. So I think the issue is, as we've kind of been discussing, is both what forum should we be using and what are the specifics of the cooperation. And here I think we have thrown out the Quad, we've thrown out these bilaterals. I think those are all useful tools. The specifics, I think, probably, as Alexa pointed out, for a lot of these things, it's just we're not as down yet, we haven't dived down yet on what those specific areas should be. I think we could roll off a list of, as we talked about already, collaborative R&D, talent exchanges, and greater transfers between on STEM education and research. Some discussion on supply chain security and best practices there. Those would all, I think, be probably the three areas we want to focus on.
Can I?
Somebody want to jump in? Yeah, go for it.
Sure. I think that I already mentioned potentially countries, they can work on greater supply chain discussion, but I will say that just in tech policy world in general, beyond semiconductors, perhaps the Japanese companies or Koreans or the governments, they can work together with allies, US and Taiwan, more on the international standard setting development. For example, we would welcome if the US and more Japanese, Koreans, they can be really involved. For example, there are a lot of standards activity going on in IoT, AI, cybersecurity. There are so many different fields that we need just the best and brightest, the technical people to go into those meetings. And a lot of times, because not a lot of the high executive in the government understand the importance of ICT standards. So a lot of time, the problem is that they cannot even get a budget approved, and they will be questioning, why do you have to go to maybe Europe for 2 weeks to just talk about standard? Because there's just a lot of recognition how important the ICT international standard is. So perhaps that's an area where, like-minded nations and democracies, they can increase budget going to those international standards meeting, and potentially cooperating on standards proposals together.
Russell, just quickly, on the actual nature of the bilateral relationships between Taiwan and Japan and Taiwan, Korea, certainly with the DPP and government in charge, Taiwan-Japan relations are excellent at all levels. They really are very productive. It changes and shifts with the KMT, but that's a story for another day. I would not put a great deal of stock in the possibility that Taiwan and South Korea would cooperate on anything, frankly. But let's not speak in totality. Let's just be, within the boundaries of this conversation. They compete head to head in so many different ways, and frankly, the relationship between the two has never been that good. So I think any effort in that department would really struggle.
Thanks for that, for all the panelists. I think this will be the final question. The question's from our own, Jennifer Chang, who's a research fellow with GTI. So her question is, should the Taiwanese government intervene in TSMC's operations in order to help procure semiconductor chips for countries such as the US, Germany, and Japan, which are requesting Taipei's assistance to help alleviate the global chip shortage? If Taipei intervenes in the market, what precedent would that set? Who would like to take that?
The answer is absolutely not.
Rupert, you're smiling over there.
Oh, seems right. It's and it's already been. Alexa touched on this as well with the point she made. Absolutely not. I mean, that would have ramifications way beyond just the chip issue. I mean, we've got the auto industry right now here in the States trying to lay claim to quotas for any companies that take US government money and set up production so they can carve out some of that year in, year out. It's a dead end. It would cause enormous problems in the supply chain to favor a specific entity or group. I 100%, Steve and Alexa are absolutely right. And touch it with a barge pole.
Okay, well, with that clarity, I think that brings us to a close exactly at 10:30 a.m. I want to thank all our panelists for this really just a riveting discussion. I think we touched on so many issues here, and I think this is really only the beginning of I think further conversations that we really need to have to discuss such a critical issue that touches in so many areas. So thanks to all our panelists, and thanks to our audience members for joining us and asking their questions. And so until our next event, stay safe, stay healthy, and take care.